Amen. Happy Sabbath. It's good to see familiar faces again after a long time, and also some new faces. I'm not sure if everyone here is aware. I'm sure some are not fully aware of what has been taught throughout this year. So some of these elements might be new to you. I would encourage you to talk to one of your leaders afterwards in the break, or write down your questions so we can try and cover those points, because there are a couple of foundational understandings that really give evidence for what I want to share today. Primarily, I suppose the underlying understanding that we must commonly agree on to be able to accept these points is our understanding of line upon line and reform lines. So that will be foundational to today's study. We've understood for about 30 years now the concept of line upon line and reform lines, how God works on a people, brings out a people from a time period of darkness or captivity, and how he prepares them to do a work. And we see that throughout history. I want us to consider some histories where God has done that work, and from them learn something about our own. I'll begin with our understanding of our reform line. We would construct our reform line. We'd call it the reform line of the 144,000. We understand that it begins at the time of the end, 1989, 30 years ago. We find that our reform lines have 5 primary waymarks. So we would speak about (1989) or the time of the end. Then we would consider 9/11, the Sunday Law, the close of probation, and the Second Advent. So this is our reform line of the 144,000. 5 primary waymarks, and they're dividing up this history into 4 parts or 4 dispensations. One dispensation, 1989 to 9/11. The second, 9/11 to Sunday Law. The third, Sunday Law to close of probation. And the fourth, the close of probation to the Second Advent. If we're going to speak about the 144,000, this is their journey, but you can also consider them from the model of agriculture. And we know that the model of agriculture has 4 steps. We would speak about the ploughing. The first stage is the ploughing stage. Second stage is the early rain. There's the third stage, the latter rain, which all leads to the time of harvest, also known as the time of trouble, or Jacob's time of trouble. So you can see from agriculture those 4 histories: ploughing, early rain, latter rain, which begins to fall at the Sunday Law, leads to the swelling of the loud cry, and prepares people for the harvest. So this is the model of our reform line of the 144,000. Back in 2014, we came to a greater understanding of this reform line, and we saw that God prepares the world. By the world I mean every individual in it, by calling them out in 3 separate groups or stages. So this is the 144,000, but when we think about God reaching a people, he does that by calling one group, training them, and then using them to prepare a second group, and then finally the third. So we would call that, we call that, based on a study of Ezra, the priests, who begin in 1989, and then they must have 5 waymarks. Four dispensations leading to a harvest. First of all, one group is called. I'll just call this the first. And then the second. And then the third. And this was from the study of Ezra. Sorry. The priests, the Levites, and then the Nethinims. First, second, and third group. This isn't all to scale, but you see the principle. The first group is called, then the second, then the third. Priests, Levites, and Nethinims. And each of their own histories is in itself a fractal. So it follows the same pattern of this larger line. The line of the 144,000 is our template. And we can take this line and in a fractal fashion, in a smaller fashion, see that it is the same experience of the first group, but in a shorter history, and then the second, and then the third. We can demonstrate that in one way from the history of Christ. The history of the 144,000 is the end of modern Israel. So if this is the end of modern Israel, we can learn about the end of modern Israel by understanding the history of the end of ancient Israel. So if we were to go back to ancient Israel, we would understand the time of the end, the birth of Christ. We mark 9/11 at his baptism. And there must be 5 primary waymarks and 4 histories, the construction of the reform line. If this is the end of modern Israel, this is the end of ancient Israel. So question, what do we do at this waymark here? The waymark of Sunday law, what's our mission? Our mission is to go to the world, or this third group. If at Sunday law we're to go to the world, we understand this history of Sunday law to close of probation being their history of harvest. Sunday law to close of probation. It's when we go to the world, we say, come out of Babylon and join Christ's church or Christ's people. That is the work of harvest. From Sunday law forward. It's the work of God's people to go into the world and say, come out of her, come out of Babylon, be cut off from the world and join God's church. So from Sunday law through to the close of probation, it's the harvest of the world. If this is the third group and the harvest of the world, go back to the time of Christ. This is the 144,000. This is the time of Christ. In the time of Christ, when do they take their gospel message and go to the world? This is 34 AD. I want to read a quote from the Great Controversy. Great Controversy 328.1. GC 328.1. She's talking about the 490-year or 70-week time prophecy. She says that the 70 weeks, or the 490 years, especially allotted to the Jews, ended in AD 34. At that time, at AD 34, through the action of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the nation sealed its rejection of the gospel by the martyrdom of Stephen and the persecution of the followers of Christ. Then the message of salvation, no longer restricted to the chosen people, was given to the world. The disciples, forced by persecution to flee from Jerusalem, went everywhere preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and preached Christ unto them. Peter, divinely guided, opened the gospel to the centurion of Caesarea. The God-fearing Cornelius and the ardent Paul, won to the faith of Christ, was commissioned to carry the glad tidings far hence unto the Gentiles. So she's talking about the 70 weeks that were allotted for the Jews. There's a time period where God is going to work with his church, and he goes to them how many times? First of all, a group are called out through the work of John. Then they're trained under Christ. And we know this first group is the disciples. At this point, is the gospel allowed to go to the world? No, they are not allowed to go to the Gentiles. First of all, God calls out the disciples. He trains them, fits them, prepares them. Why can they not go straight to the world? They have complete misconceptions about what their job function is, even as a nation. So back in this history, if they had have gone to the Gentiles, what type of message would they have given them? A troubled message. In many elements, a wrong message. They did not understand their role as a nation or their own individual responsibility. They did not understand the nature of Christ's kingdom. So first the disciples must be drawn away. They must be trained up and taught under John the Baptist and Christ until they have unlearned their Laodicean misunderstandings of Christ's kingdom. And they are brought to a testing time. Once they have been prepared, where do they go? Do they go to the Gentiles? No. Where do they go at Pentecost? Back to the church. So two groups. First of all, one are trained. One must have a correct message and a correct understanding of Christ's kingdom if they are going to go to the second group. The second group is reached. And then at 34 AD, the gospel goes to the third. This is the world, or the Gentiles. So you see three groups at the end of ancient Israel, three groups at the end of modern Israel. If any of you are familiar with the studies of Acts 27, we learn from Acts 27 this waymark of Sunday law of 34 AD, that this is the ship of Alexandria, the United States and Adventism, sailing throughout history from 1798 through 1844, 1863, and what is Sunday law? Shipwreck. And at shipwreck, what does Paul do? He goes to the third group, the island of Melita. So this all is reinforced by the study of Acts 27. When we consider this history from the time of the end, or particularly from 9/11 to Sunday law, it can look like an empty space, but I want to encourage you with just how much we have to learn. 9/11 to the Sunday law is what history up here? It's the baptism of Christ to 34 AD. Almost the entirety of the Gospels can be placed between 9/11 and Sunday law. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of them are telling the history of the preparation of that first group. The preparation of the first group before they have even gone back to the second or to the world. So those stories become extremely relevant for us today. So this is all the common understanding within the movement. Even those who are now attacking the message look at these lines and say that they are powerful and that they fit. There is so much evidence that has been used to build up the strength of these reform lines. Each one of these histories is a message that God gives to use and prepare his people. So when we consider the first group called the priests in the line of the 144,000, 1989 to 9/11, 9/11 to 2014, 2014 to 2019, 2019 to Panium. 4 histories: ploughing, early rain, latter rain, harvest. So in this first history, this first group called, we understand that we are ploughed from 1989 to 9/11, and what ploughed us, what prepared us for the sowing of the seed? What did God give us? A message. We're given a message in this history that prepares us for the early rain. So we are expected to be prepared in this early history. When God gives us a message with new information, saying, this is the history of Daniel 11 verse 40, prophecies under fulfillment, and God is again gathering his people. There is a message that comes in this history that prepares God's people. So just as these lines are, just as they exist, people find themselves in agreement. They understand that these lines have power and a great deal of evidence to place them. Where people start to become unstuck, where they start to fight against these lines, is not when they see these lines on a board or when they're laid out in this fashion. Because this is evident on so many different levels. Where they start to fall away is when they begin to understand the implication of what these lines mean. I want to give you one example without going into detail. The first group called from 1989 to 9/11 in this history here, we're prepared. How are we prepared? God has a message. He's going to prepare the people, prepare them for the sowing and the early rain by giving them a source of information that contains the truth that they need to prepare themselves for the sowing of the seed. We understand that the world, the Nethinims, the harvests, one after the other. First group harvested, second group harvested, third group harvested, just as in the history of Christ. So, first group ploughed, second group ploughed, third group ploughed. So question, 2014 to 2019 is the ploughing of the world. They're being prepared for the sowing of the seed and the early rain, correct? So what ploughs the priests? What ploughs the first group? The message of John, a true message. So what ploughs the Nethinims? Because 2014 begins that ploughing work. It ends in 2019, November 9, 4 weeks' time. So we understand that they are have almost completed this first dispensation of ploughing. Just seeing the lines on the board does not shake people. It's the implications of those lines that start to shake people. When we recognize that if there's a true source of information that prepared us for our early rain, then there must be a true source of information that prepared the world for theirs. That fact alone has caused a great many people heartburn, but it's self-evident when you construct line upon line. I want us to consider our reform line, the reform line of the priests. 1989 through to 2019. The close of probation. Shut door. So this is our reform line as a priest. And we understand that 2014 lines up with what waymark? Remember, this is a fractal. We've taken the line of the 144,000 and we are a fractal representation of that reform line. So 2014, the middle waymark is what waymark? Sunday law. It's the waymark of Sunday law for the first group of people. So if 2014 is the waymark of Sunday law, what are the implications of that? Again, this is where some people begin to experience heartburn. I want to erase much of this so I can expand the main topics of conversation that we will have today. When we understand that this movement has been active now for 30 years, beginning in 1989, when we understand that we are 5 years into our Sunday law history, a few weeks from our shut door, it begins to raise very pertinent questions that have been concerning people for the last few years. And I want to attempt to give an answer to some of those questions. And I want to do that not by going back to the history of Christ, but back to the history of the Millerites. So just to remind us, the line of the 144,000. First, God calls out one group, then the second, and then the third, same as in the line of Christ. I mentioned, and I will remind us one more time, the lines themselves people claim to agree with, but there are implications that cause people heartburn. I mentioned one of them. There is a message that prepares or plows the first group. Therefore, it's self-evident that there must be a preparation of the second and a preparation of the third. And when you start to consider what the preparation of the third looks like and who does that work, people are troubled. And we will come back around at the end of our presentation to discuss that. But I want to primarily focus on our history, the line of the priests, and I'll redraw it. So we're in the Sunday law history from 2014. In the Sunday law history, what occurs? If you were to go to Daniel 11:41, a side effect of the Sunday law history. You know at Sunday law there's a testing message, and what does that testing message cause? He shall enter also into the glorious land. That's the Sunday law. And many shall be overthrown. So what do you expect to see at Sunday law? Many are overthrown, and who are the many? If you're already in the hand of the papacy, if you're already under the control of the papacy, can you be overthrown? No, they already have you. The world is not overthrown. Who is overthrown? It must be those that were not under the control of the papacy, those who were free. So it is not the world, it is God's people. In the history of the priests, we'll draw up our 5 waymarks, our fractal. The first group called. They're called out in 1989, the time of the end. They're ploughing. 9/11, the seed is sown. 2014 begins the early rain. 9/11, the early rain. 2014, the latter rain. 2019, the harvest. 5 key waymarks. The middle waymark, which from other studies you may hear identified as midway or midnight, is the waymark associated with the Sunday law. That begins the swelling of the midnight cry or the loud cry, depending on the history or people you're referring to. 2019, the close of probation, Paneum, the second advent. So this is our fractal. 2014 marking the waymark of Sunday law. If Daniel 11:41 identifies that at the Sunday law waymark there's a test, and who is overthrown? Those who fail the test, or God's people. So in this history, who's receiving the message? The first group of people. It's this movement. So who's going to be overthrown in this history? Those who receive the test or the message. They're the only ones who can be overthrown. So if you're looking for an overthrowing, and in our own history of Sunday law, where do you look? Not to the world. It's into this movement. It's not the reform line itself, because we can see this reform line through the weight of so much evidence in every history, an increase of knowledge, a formalization and a test. 1989 to 9/11, there was an increase of knowledge, which was 1989 to 1991, a formalization in 1996, and a test, 9/11. (9/11) to 2014, in every history, an increase of knowledge, a formalization and a test. In our history, 2014 to 2019, an increase of knowledge, a formalization and a test. So we have this repeating pattern. In every one of these 4 dispensations, there's going to be a message comes that tests God's people. And we can see that in Millerite history. 1798 to 1840, William Miller has an increase of knowledge, it's formalized, it's tested. The message of Samuel Snow, given at July at Boston, increase of knowledge to Concord, and then at Exeter was formalized. October 22, they're tested. So we see this repeating pattern throughout history. And when we come to our reform line, in each one of these dispensations, God is giving his people a message that they will accept or reject, pass or fail. As I said, this itself, just stating that, seeing the pattern, does not give people heartburn. It is then the implications of that. I want to remind us what the disciples said to Jesus when he was taking them through this history in their own fractal. They said to Jesus, his message is a hard saying, who can hear it? And what do they mean when they say hard? The word hard means of a person. It can mean, if you say a hard person, a harsh person, a stern person. But when you're referring to a thing, it can mean violent, offensive, intolerable. So what are the disciples saying about Christ's message? When they're in this history, in their fractal, they're saying Christ's message is violent, offensive, and intolerable. Who can hear it? In the book of Romans, it's stated, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling block and a rock of offense. So God does not hide that to many people, the message of Christ, or Christ himself, was a rock of offense, designed to offend if they could not see the truth in his message. So we can expect the same thing. The implications of these reform lines people can find offensive and intolerable. I want us to go back to the Millerite history. We looked very briefly at the history of Christ when we saw the three groups, the disciples, Pentecost back to the church, and then to the Gentiles in 34 AD. We took that line down and saw the 144,000, the exact same pattern. I want us to consider the Millerites. What is the key external issue in the time of the Millerites? The key external issue. I'm not referring to internal, but externally there was a key subject that was the most controversial of their time. From the time that the United States rises into history, from 1798 through the 1840s, 50s and 60s, the key external issue is all about slavery. It finally comes to its head in the 1860s Civil War. And it's this issue of slavery that I want us to discuss. So without directly overlaying, I want us to identify the history of the Millerites and what we can learn from their experience. So we would place it on a reform line. From the time of the end, 1798. I want us to identify that from the external issues throughout this history as it related to slavery. Ellen White is going to write in the 1890s, I want to quote her, from SPM, I believe that's Spalding and McGann, 19.6. SPM 19.6. She's writing here in the late 1890s, I think. She says, "The same spirit that held the coloured people in slavery is not dead, but it's alive today and ready to spring into activity. So the spirit that held the black people in slavery is not gone. It's alive and it's going to become active again. The same spirit of oppression is still cherished in the minds of many of the white people of the South and will reveal itself in cruel deeds, which are the manifestation of their religious zeal." I want us to think about the implications of that. She's talking about the issue of slavery. Slavery is gone, racism is not. Oppression is not gone. She says it's going to reveal itself in cruel deeds by the white people of the South. And what are those cruel deeds a manifestation of? Her words are religious zeal. Think of the implications of that. The cruel deeds exhibited by the South are a manifestation of their understanding of religion. Slavery and oppression in their history was an issue of church and state. It was a religious issue. So in Millerite history, the religious zeal of the churches and of the people manifested itself in the issue of slavery, which is why we find it as the key external issue throughout Millerite history. And how did the South defend their understanding of slavery? They used two books. The two books they used to defend themselves. I'm going to say that this is the South, and they defended slavery through the Constitution and the Bible. So the South is going to defend slavery through the Constitution and the Bible. If you were to go to Genesis 17:23, Genesis 17:23. It says, Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised them. So what is that saying? Who did Abraham circumcise? His son, all who were born in his house, and all the slaves he bought with his money. Abraham was a slave owner. These are the quotes that the South are going to use, strong quotes, to defend their practice of slavery. And there are others. So on one side you find the South arguing for slavery using the Constitution and the Bible. On the other side in this history, you will find, I'm going to be vague about it, you'll write the North, but it's also Ellen White and the Millerites. And they're arguing against slavery. And what are they using? The Constitution and the Bible. I'm going to just quote a couple of Ellen White passages. First is the Review and Herald, August 27. Review and Herald, August 27, 1861, paragraph 4. She's talking about a slave law. She says that this slave law is calculated to crush out of human beings every noble and generous feeling of sympathy towards the slave. That this slave law is in direct opposition to the teachings of Christ. So Ellen White is going to condemn slavery using the Bible. She says, men were blinded and grossly deceived in the last American election, and their influence was used to place in authority men who would wink at evil, men who would witness a flood of woe and misery unmoved, whose principles are corrupt, who sympathize with the South, and who would preserve slavery as it is. I want you to note, she is speaking politically. She is making strong political statements relevant to her time. These are just two examples. She speaks extensively on the issue of slavery, but our pioneers, particularly even Joseph Bates in the 1830s, before he even became a Millerite, was an open abolitionist. You find two sides, whether it was the South or the Millerites and the abolitionists of the North, arguing for their position for or against slavery using the same books. The problem is that they read them differently. They come to different conclusions based on how they read. I want to quote, this is James White. James White in 1862, in the early years of the Civil War. He says, for the past 10 years, through the 1850s, the Review has taught that the United States of America was a subject of prophecy, and that slavery is pointed out in the prophetic word as the darkest and most damning sin of the United States. Those of our people who voted at all at the last presidential election to a man voted for Abraham Lincoln. These are strong political statements relevant for their time regarding this issue of slavery, and they identified slavery as the most damning sin of the United States. We've done, other studies have been done that go through this history quite precisely. But I just want us to see the connection between their own history and our own. For those years from 1798 through the 1840s, 50s, and then through the Civil War, they're taking a strong political position about the actions or the sin of the United States, and they identify that that sin in their history is slavery. And that issue of slavery is not disconnected from the churches. I want to remind us, and I'll keep reminding us, of that first Ellen White quote we read, where she said that the South and their position on slavery was an exhibition of their religious zeal. That's going to become important when we see how that issue has progressed through the last 150 years. One more quote in 1 T 359.2. She's speaking to a brother who is favourable towards slavery. That whole passage is relevant, but for time I'm going to move forward and just quote 2 sentences. She says to this brother who is favourable towards slavery, "You must yield your views of slavery or the truth. Both cannot be cherished in the same heart, for they are at war with each other." So this external political issue of slavery was what to them? It was a test. You either relinquished their political views or were forced to yield up the views of the Millerites of the movement. You could not cherish the understanding, the prophetic understanding of the movement and pro-slavery views in the same heart. One must be surrendered. Reminding us, in the 1890s, Ellen White says that slavery, the spirit of it, is not dead, but will continue to manifest itself. One way it manifested itself after this history, and we place Millerite history extending through to 1863, which is the history of the Civil War. Again, slavery being the key issue of that time. The main way you find it, or one of the ways that you find that oppression was able to continue, was in the history of the 1890s. So in the 1890s, there are leading people who are trying to find a way to make sure that the black population is still subjugated. And they come up with a doctrine which they call separate but equal. And this is written into law. So in the 1890s, in the history when Ellen White is saying that those racist principles are still in existence, they come up with this law of separate but equal. And what they're saying is that black and white is equal. Black is equal to white, but they are to be separated. And every time you say equal but, what are you really saying? Not equal. And that is why when you find this placed into law, which in one word was segregation. This is where segregation came from. It all began in the 1890s with this law that said that black and white are equal but must be kept separate. So separate schools, separate colleges and hospitals, separate doors to enter into. They must be separated. And this law continued from the 1890s until the middle of last century in the 1950s. So I want us to backtrack a little in our history and see how this issue is connected to our own day. The 1890s, they placed segregation into law. That continues through decades until the early 1950s. Around 1951, I'll begin with 1951. Back in 1951, there was a group of black families in the United States so 51 to 54. In 1951, a few black families came together in the United States, and they decided that they did not want their children receiving an improper education. A consequence of this separate but equal is that there really is no equal. And when there is no equal and they're separated, the white schools got the funding, the black schools didn't. And the families that came together in the early 1950s, the black families, said, our children deserve an equal education, therefore we should have the right to send them to a white school. And this is the court case, one of the most famous court cases in US history, known as Brown versus Board of Education. One of the most famous court cases in US history. First of all, that they sued their local district to allow their children to attend a white school, and they lost that court case. So then they took it to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the nation, and in 1954 the Supreme Court ruled that this doctrine of equal but separate and segregation violated the Constitution, and segregation was, by the Supreme Court, ruled to be illegal. And this is where segregation began to end, by this Supreme Court ruling. So it was the work of these families and their attempts to educate their children that began to remove segregation from US society. But there was a problem. The spirit of slavery still existed in the churches of the South, and this caused a violent, aggressive response by the religious right in America. Again, the slavery of the South was a manifestation of their religious zeal. It was based on their understanding of religion, that they are somehow on an elevated status to others. This beginning of ending of segregation greatly angered the evangelical leaders in America in that time, and I'm going to mention a couple of them to you. A couple of those key leaders were so against sending their white children to a desegregated school. They were so sure that they did not want their white children interacting with black students that they began to set up universities in the South, private universities. So after segregation begins to end in the history of 1954 and in the years following, you'll understand this is also leading into the civil rights movement. In this history, they begin to set up schools. One of them that we will speak about a little bit is Liberty University. Prior to that, known as Lynchburg University, and it's in the South, and you know where they get that name from. That's how deep racism existed in the South. But they changed the name, ironically enough, to Liberty University, and this university was created and run by a key man in this history known as Jerry Falwell. One of the most leading evangelicals of that time period. It's not just him. Many private universities spring up in the South just as segregation is ending, because if it's a private university, the government cannot force you to desegregate. Only the public universities were being desegregated. So if they formed a private Christian university in the South, they were free to practice segregation. But then the government steps in. The government stepped in around the 1970s, 60s and 70s, and started to pressure these private Christian universities. And what the government said to them is, if you want to have a segregated school, Christian, evangelical segregated school in the South, that's okay. But you're no longer tax exempt and you have to start paying taxes. So the government began to remove their tax-exempt standing. They did not want to start paying taxes. That would be detrimental to their school, and this created a wave of anger throughout the Christian right in the South. particularly, through the nation, but particularly the South. If any of you are known, the movement in the United States, it's been particularly centered in the state of Arkansas, and in Arkansas there is this town known as Little Rock. If any of you are familiar with Little Rock, when segregation ended and that public school was to allow in black students, what was the response? Those southern white people were so against desegregation that they blocked the school, and the government was forced to send in the army, and you have these little black children, just children, being led to school every morning for a year by the United States Army. That was how much they had to force the schools to desegregate. But the government keeps adding pressure. And Arkansas is in the South. It's has that continuing legacy. But these are these southern universities, and when the government says that they're going to take away their tax-exempt status, they begin to politically mobilise, and this is where it leads into where we are today. Jerry Falwell begins to meet with the leading religious evangelical leaders of the United States, and they decide that it's time to no longer submit to the dictates of the government, but because of their religious zeal, the same religious zeal you find in this history by the South, their same religious zeal in this history is going to drive them to start interacting with the government, not all the government, but the Republican Party. They took strong conservative positions against not just race, but also gender, and also their approach to homosexuality. Jerry Falwell once said that a gay-friendly church he knew of would one day be utterly annihilated and heaven would celebrate. He said homosexuals are brute beasts. So they had this language through a few different issues, particularly when it came to homosexuality, when it came to gender, but what initially galvanized the religious right was the civil rights movement and desegregation. I'm going to quote from a news article written more recently that has covered some of this history. For Jerry Falwell, back in the 1970s, the question that he was attacking, the beginning of what is known today as a culture war, was desegregation. Falwell was a rabid segregationist and railed against the civil rights movement from the pulpit. I want to quote Jerry Falwell, that leading evangelical, on this Supreme Court decision to end segregation. He said that if those justices of the Supreme Court had have understood God's word, if they had have understood the Bible and desired to do the will of God, they would never have ended segregation. What is he justifying his beliefs on? They used the Constitution and their understanding of the Bible and said that segregation was a Bible principle, and they had verses for that. Jerry Falwell said, "The true black person does not want integration. He realizes his potential is far better among his own race." Falwell went on to announce that integration will destroy the white race eventually. In one northern city, he warned, up in the north, he has this friend who's a pastor, and a couple of doors down from him, or actually next door, live a couple of mixed race. And he says this with anger and surprise, that in the north, a pastor friend of him has a mixed race couple living next door. Through the 1960s, as you find the civil rights movement begin, you find the Christian right galvanized, and Falwell began to lean more and more on conspiracy theories, another element you find used by the Christian right. He said that Martin Luther King was a communist spy. He says that the leaders of the civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr., James Farmer and others, had left-wing associations. They were obviously communists, and they were doing all they could in their part of the world to take advantage of the American situation and exploit every incident to bring about violence and bloodshed. So using conspiracy theories also in his repertoire, it was regularly attacking Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. They lost that fight within the civil rights movement, and he began to retreat from publicly stating those views. These academies, Lynchburg Academy and then Liberty University, they changed their name into, were particularly private schools for white students started by those evangelical leaders, particularly segregated academies, as an open attempt to circumvent the integration. There's a couple of other leaders in this period. That's Jerry Falwell. We could also discuss Paul Weyrich, a leading evangelical of that time. Pat Robinson. Billy Graham was less vocal with them, siding with them on these issues, but we'll discuss the political views of his children. Paul Weyrich was trying to bring together these leading evangelicals, and he said he was trying to unite the evangelicals or the Christian right on the issues of abortion and homosexuality and different issues. But he said what particularly united the Christian right in the 1970s was not abortion, as they try to say today, but the issue of the civil rights movement and of segregation. He said in the mid-1970s, Paul Weyrich, "We must have a new political philosophy, the Christian right. It must be defined by the conservatives in moral terms, packaged in non-religious language, and propagated throughout the country by a new coalition. When political power is achieved, the moral majority will have the opportunity to recreate the United States." As a leader of that organisation that they founded in 1979, Jerry Falwell began to lead it. They founded this organisation in 1979, and they named it the Moral Majority. It existed for 10 years, from 1979, and it dissolved in 1989. Jerry Falwell, quoting, he said that their mission was to train and mobilise and electrify the religious right in America. Quoting him, "We're fighting a holy war. We need to lead the nation back to the moral stance that made America great. The Christian right, need to wield influence on those who govern us." I want us to be reminded of a statement of A.T. Jones. A.T. Jones says the Constitution or the government, who are they designed to protect? He says, this is quoting A.T. Jones, "Isn't it peculiar that, or an altogether singular and new doctrine, that the government of the people are there to protect the majority? From whom are they protecting the majority? From themselves, most assuredly. Because by their own representation they are so vastly in the majority that it would be impossible for them to be oppressed by anyone else. The protection guaranteed in our constitutional provisions means protection to the minority. The majority can protect itself. Constitutions are enacted for the purpose of protecting the weak against the strong, the few against the many." So the Constitution and the US government is there to protect the minority, not the majority. But because you see the issue of segregation and the civil rights movement, this is what unites the religious right together. And in 1979, the religious right formed an organisation called the Moral Majority, headed by Jerry Falwell, who we discussed previously. Jerry Falwell said their first mission was to elect a conservative American president. They had their first victory in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. And they had much to do with his election victory. First victory, Reagan. Second victory in 1988 with the election of George Bush. 1989, Jerry Falwell dissolves the moral majority and he says, "We have completed our mission, we have electrified the religious right, and we've placed in government who we need." He knows that by 1989, the time of the end for this movement, they have already accomplished their purpose. They've begun a course that now cannot be turned, but with the election of Reagan and the election of George Bush and the uniting of the religious right in America. They find that they begin to be disappointed with even Reagan and Bush, that these conservative presidents are not as radical as they were expecting. They aren't implementing the moral stance of the religious right when it comes to race and gender and homosexuality as much as these leaders had envisioned. So you come to 9/11 and you find a crisis. 2001, 9/11. All of a sudden, the evangelical leaders begin to unite again. One evangelical leader who more of late has had a great deal to do with Donald Trump. I cannot temporarily find her name. But she speaks. She's an evangelical leader in our time with a mega church, a prosperity gospel speaker. But she spoke that in 9/11 they all united because they all began to share what message? In 2001 you have the children of Billy Graham, who I said we would speak of before. His daughter Anne says that 9/11, or the attack on the Twin Towers, was a judgment of God. It's God's judgment. He's allowing this to happen because we're shaking our fist in God's face. And they aren't going to attack the race issue. That's too toxic now. They can't be open with their issues of racism. Instead, she begins to say it is because of immorality, homosexuality, and feminism. So down at 9/11, you have two sides. I want us to be reminded, in this history, when you have all of these issues and this religious doctrine of slavery, which is what it was to them, when you have the religious doctrine of slavery and the Sunday law issues, who's protesting all through this history? Whether it's slavery or church and state and Sunday, who's protesting? It's the Millerites. It's Ellen White, A.T. Jones. All through this history, whether it was the issue of slavery or Sunday keeping, our pioneers protested and fought against those issues. Who's protesting in this history? It's not Adventists. What state are we in? We're in a Laodicean condition. We're sleeping and in darkness. Laodicean Adventists do not see the importance of this history, the changes in the US government, the galvanizing of the religious right. Adventists don't see it. And when God's people are silent, what happens? The stones begin to cry out. So the protest you find happening in this history is not from God's people. Instead, in 1948, which is a waymark on our reform line, you see a different protest start, and that is an organisation in America known as, I'll write it out because it's something you should research, look up their website, Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. And they form in 1948. And it hasn't been Adventists who've protested throughout this history. It's been the stones crying out. And this organisation is a key one who, even in our history, are one of the most vocal, crying crying out against the church and state union that's occurring today. In 2001, you see these unite: Jerry Falwell, Pat Robinson, the children, the two children of Billy Graham at 9/11, saying this is the judgment of God because the United States has rejected the morality of the majority. And again, we begin to see church and state become an issue in our history today. There's been studies that cover this history in a greater detail. I want to move past some of that, or refer to you to those studies if you wish to see it, or we'll also review some at camp. But just to see in our history what's been happening. 2014 is what waymark for us? It's Sunday law. So you know there's going to be an issue with church and state. And this issue, what I'm hoping we can see, is not disconnected from the same issues that galvanised the Millerites. And instead what we've been finding from 2014, particularly under the work of leading evangelicals, and I want to name one leading Catholic evangelical, Steve Bannon, is that you again find them engaging in a culture war, trying to enforce the morality of the majority through the government of the nation. In 2014, that process begins. Internally, we know that 2014 is our Sunday law, and there is a message that begins here that begins to swell. There is an increase of knowledge, and a formalisation at the midnight cry, and a test, November 9, 2019. These two waymarks are 2016 and 2018. So internally, this is the beginning of a message that's growing to swell into the midnight cry. 2016 also being a waymark. So externally, what is it? Externally, you see the issues in the United States. It all begins in 2014 with the work of Steve Bannon. And then externally, it begins to swell. 2016, the election of Trump. 2018, unrestrained. 2019, dictatorship. And what propelled Donald Trump to power, beginning from 2014, was the Christian right. Specifically, in this history, what began our reform line with Reagan and Bush was Jerry Falwell. In 2016, the religious right in the United States threw their full political support and backing behind Donald Trump as a presidential candidate. And who led that was Jerry Falwell Jr. The father began our reform line with bringing church and state and the election of Reagan and Bush, and then we find from 2014 through our reform line the final president of the United States won that election with 81% of the evangelical vote, all led by the son of Jerry Falwell Jr., and the full support of Liberty University. In our history today, I just want to reference something that happened recently. There was a shooting, a mass shooting in America. And what do you find the religious right say? And when I say the religious right now, I'm hoping people have watched enough to know that I'm also referring to Fox News. On Fox News, you have leading speakers on a news channel saying that the reason there is a mass shooting is because Americans need to repent because our culture has created a division between us and God, where we have hate and immorality inside the heart that's disconnected ourselves from God, and we've lost our values. they're saying it is because a lack of morality that there are these mass shootings. Keeping in mind that most of those mass shootings are by white supremacists, and where do they get that from? So there's a response made by a South African commentator. He hears that, and his response is, in the 1960s, God told white evangelicals that black and white people shouldn't mix. So why are the white evangelicals saying that black and white shouldn't mix in that history, and then expecting they know the social ills of our time? So you can see why they're not being listened to. From the history of the Millerites, in closing, we find the issue was slavery from the 1798 all the way through the Civil War history, marking the end of their reform line in 1863. That's what they fought against and saw as the primary sin of the nation. You come to the history of the 1890s, and Ellen White is saying that spirit still exists and will still lead to oppression. In that history, segregation is placed into law. That segregation exhibits itself through those decades as the forced separation of black from white. This all ends in the early 1950s with a court case, Brown versus Board of Education, that reunites the religious right to form these conservative universities and to mobilise as a political force. That mobilisation was the moral majority of this 10-year history leading to the time of the end. From 79 to 89, they united particularly with the Republican Party. Reagan, a Republican president. Bush, a Republican president. And by 1989, Jerry Falwell says, we've succeeded in our mission. 1996, you see the formalisation of Fox News. Fox News is the mouthpiece of these conservative leaders. Through this history, 9/11, that's who's sharing that message. You come to 2014, there's the Sunday law. It's a point of test. And what is the unspoken but obvious sore point for leading conservative evangelicals in America here? Tracing where they've come from. You have a black president in the White House. So from his election through to 2014, you can see Fox News and those leading evangelicals becoming more and more active and hostile. They've been tested. Why did God choose this point in history to give America a black president? If it wasn't to poke them where they hurt, it was a test. And in this history, under Obama, how is he treating the religious right? He's not giving them any political power. And so they decide it's time to regain the political power that they'd started to lose. Particularly the work of Steve Bannon in 2014. That begins to work to bring about a conservative Republican president of outside even the Republican establishment. He's looking for an extremist. 2016, he succeeds in that work, but he does that with 81% of the evangelical vote. This was the work of Jerry Falwell. This is the work of Jerry Falwell. The excuse being used by the Christian right, and I want us to be careful with how personal this becomes. In this history, they're using their understanding of the Constitution and the Bible to defend their issues of relating to equality. You find that in 1865, Abraham Lincoln is killed. Why is he killed? The man that killed him was pro-slavery. But he didn't own slaves. What did he say? What had upset the man, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln, was not just the ending of slavery, it was that he felt like he no longer had his free speech. He felt like the North had taken away his free speech, so that he could no longer say, I believe in slavery, and feel comfortable in good society. That's how he felt he'd been impacted. He's the classic white supremacist that you see today. They're saying that all these people have taken away their right to feel comfortable, to exhibit their free speech, not to own slaves, but to be able to speak about it. It's the same excuse you find being used by that same community today, but we have it not just in America, it exists in Australia, it exists in Brazil, it exists in the UK, so that you find people saying, I'm not necessarily just against them all, I just want my free speech. I want to be able to say, homosexuals go to hell. I want to be able to say that and not feel uncomfortable in good society because it's my religious liberty. That's how deceptive the arguments of the South become. The Christian right are able to use the Constitution and the Bible to their advantage if we accept their interpretation of it. When we come down to our history, we find 2019. I hope everyone is following the news to see what is currently happening in the United States. For some years now, before the election of Donald Trump, we knew what this next president was going to be. From 2018, we knew what he was going to do this year. The dictatorship, the attacks on the media. All of this has not come as a surprise, but we are in the middle of seeing a fulfillment of all of our expectations. In this history, was the North partly right and the South partly right? Did the South have a point? What's their point? They have slavery, but did the Millerites say, you know, the South has a point? We should listen to some of what they have to say about this issue. No. It was right and wrong, truth and error. And people that are falling in our Sunday law history are falling over what issue? They want to say, yeah, but the Conservatives have a point. Jerry Falwell has a point. There must be a mixture of truth and error and a mixture of truth and error. They're afraid to take a hard position. Ellen White said that you cannot take the side of slavery, you cannot take the position of that evangelical Christian right and maintain the truths of this movement. One must surrender. They cannot exist in the same heart. And when they cannot exist in the same heart, you find that the people tested by the message of this dispensation give up one or they give up the other. 2014 was a turning point. We've recognised that for some time. Even externally, people recognise this. Those Christian voices impacting Washington. In 2014, I want to quote one of them. She says, "The separation of church and state is a liberal leftist plan to ruin America and will be the death knell for our nation." You understand how they take the position of church and state. In the Millerite history, the key external issue they all identified was one of equality. Both sides used the same books, but had different interpretations. Both sides said all men are created equal, but they argued about what the word all meant. They had different methods of interpretation. And when we come down today, in this history, we find that there are two sides. With much the same prejudices that has continued from 1798 through to our own time, where you find one side, the evangelical right, particularly still prevalent in the South, standing with Donald Trump. And this Christian agenda of inequality. They're going to use the Constitution and the Bible. And what you have is many Adventists, even many people who have been in this movement for a long time, seeing their arguments and say, yeah, they have a point. If you couldn't do that in this history, you can't do it with this one. And then you have the other side. this movement. But it's not just this movement now. There are stones crying out. There are churches in America, white churches and black churches, saying, we reject this coming together of church and state. We see the combination of church and state and we reject it. And you see them, I'll just say the North, but it's not just the North. It's a little more fluid now. And they're saying, we reject the church and state. It's not our understanding of the Constitution or the Word of God. One side, both sides are not a mixture of truth and error. We either stand on one or the other. And Ellen White says, we cannot hold the principles of both in the same heart. Because of that, you see why this message that has begun from 2014 and continued to grow into the midnight cry of 2018 has caused division and heartache for many people. Because they find that they're old ideas that have defended or seen the world in much the same light as this evangelical right movement led by Jerry Falwell cannot exist in the same heart as the teachings of this movement. And a division must occur. One must be surrendered. Ellen White says, in regard to this history, the history of slavery, there is no such thing as a neutral position. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you how you have led and guided your people. Lord, we look back at the beginning of our history. Father, they understood the political issues that surrounded them. They did not only understand them, they knew where they stood in regards to those issues. Those that voted knew who they voted for and whether or not they'd voted correctly. Father, I pray that we will have the same clarity today as we come into perilous times where many without this message are afraid as they do not understand what is happening, why so clearly the world is coming to an end. I pray, Lord, that we will have the same vision. We'll be united as a movement and know what we stand for. I pray you'll continue to give us light, that we will continue to search for it and be properly prepared as the disciples were prepared, Lord, to be able to reach all those who need to be reached with this message. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.